Alrighty, hello everybody. Welcome to the latest webinar in our alumni webinar series. Our chapter webinar series. My name is Bahia Simons Lane. I'm the Executive Director of USJETAA, and I'll be moderating the webinar tonight. First, I'd like to welcome today's speakers, Kyle Munn and Jennifer Murawski. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar will provide information on how to navigate copyright issues that might impact your JETAA chapter. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce USJETAA's programs. We provide resources for individual JET alumni, JETAA chapters nationwide, and potential JET participants. We support the leadership of the 19 US JETAA chapters with programming, membership recruitment, chapter management, leadership, professional development, and more. If you're a JET program alumni and aren't already a member, please join for free today at usjetaa.org. We currently run 3 programs for JETAA chapters. The first is a partnership with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA to provide grant funding to chapters and subchapters so they can hold events in their local communities on US-Japan relations. We also facilitate a leadership program, which is funded by the Japan Foundation CGP and CLARE, where representatives from USJETAA visit JETAA chapters and subchapters to hold tailored workshops focused on leaderships and growth. Applications for this program are accepted on a rolling basis, and we are seeking applicants for these visits right now. Our third program is the webinar series, which you are listening to right now. We hold 2 different series, one for JETAA chapter leaders, and the other is for individual JET alumni. Thank you for being a part of it. Before I turn the mic over to Kyle, I would like to let attendees know that we are recording the webinar and we'll post it on our website for those who can't attend. Please hold your questions until the end of the webinar, or you can type them at any time using the chat or Q&A features. During the Q&A at the end, you can use the raise hand function if you would like to ask a question using your microphone or phone. Now, without further ado, I am going to turn over the controls to Kyle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kyle Munn, and I'm going to pull up my slides real quick. All right. All right, so I was a JET in Shiga Prefecture from 2006 to 2010. Since then, I've been working in communications and marketing, most recently with a company called iContact as a strategic advisor, helping clients with issues like these. So, you know, we're all guilty of this. You're putting together a newsletter and you need a photo quick. So you go to Google and you're like, yay, Google's got all these great images, right? But what happens if you use an image that is copyrighted? You have now opened yourself up to potentially expensive litigation. Many large media firms now have software that trolls through the internet looking for instances of their copyrighted works. If you get caught, their lawyers can and often will send you a cease and desist letter outlining monetary penalties. Now, I'm sure somebody right now watching this is thinking, but Kyle, isn't Scrooge McDuck a copyright of Disney? You are absolutely right. But the comics from the 40s had their copyright protection end about 15 years ago because they were copyrighted before the 1974 copyright law, which is much more prohibitive than back in the 40s. And somebody else is probably thinking, but what about fair use? If I'm not using the image to make money, it's okay, right? Well, the thing is that there are 4 main elements that determine whether you can use a copyrighted work as fair use. So the first one is the purpose and character of your use. Copyright law today typically favors non-commercial, educational, or historical use. That said, the Supreme Court in the 50s ruled that the use of work has to be transformative. So for example, publishing a photo of Kiyomizu-dera in Kyoto in an article talking about its architectural history could be considered fair use by the courts. Slapping an image of the temple up as a header image of your JETAA website is less likely to be considered fair use. The second thing is the nature of the copyrighted work. Is the work being being copied informational or entertainment. Items copied from factual sources are more likely to fall under fair use, such as a newspaper article or an academic paper. The third one is the amount of copyrighted work that you have used. How much of the work was copied? Did you use an entire photo or just a small piece of the photo? The more of the work you use, the less likely the courts will rule in your favor. This often comes up in music lawsuits. Most recently was the legal spat between Pharrell Williams and Marvin Gaye's estate over the song Blurred Lines. The court awarded Gaye's family over $7 million in restitution, and it was a bad day for Pharrell Williams. The fourth one is the effect of the use on potential revenue. So is the material you're copying affecting the copyright owner's ability to make money now or in the future? And this is kind of a gray area that judges have ruled all over the place on over the years. So basically all that to say, you're better off avoiding potentially copyrighted images because there's plenty of other options available. And I think I saw someone had a question. Maybe not. Okay. So for example, since the start of the internet, we now have Creative Commons, and this was created because there was a need on the internet to have images that didn't have these onerous copyright rules to them. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty of how Creative Commons works. You can look at that on their website. But there's a lot of different images on the internet now that use Creative Commons, and as long as you're attributing to the person who made that material, you can use it. Let's see. All right, and now more generally about finding photos that you can use. For example, all these nice photos I have at the bottom have no copyright restrictions whatsoever. So there are a lot of different websites that you can use to get free and low cost images. These are some that I recommend that are really good. Another one that I did not put on here is Adobe Spark, which is a free service that Adobe has that's similar to Canva. And I definitely recommend checking all these out. They have all sorts of images. Sometimes you have to get a little bit creative with the search terms that you use, but typically you should be able to find an image that will work for whatever you're doing on one of these sites. Also, I recommend checking out the Japan National Tourism Organization. They have a photo library on their website that the images are free for you to use, and they have a ton of images on there. So, if you're looking for cherry blossoms or a temple or, kids in yukata, they probably have it on here and you're welcome to use them. A lot of people like to go to Flickr and use content on there, but you want to proceed with caution on Flickr because there are instances where people are uploading copyrighted images that they don't actually own the copyright to, and then you think it's okay to use it when it's actually not. So when you're on Flickr, you can actually set the license so that you can try to weed out some of those images that you can't actually use. Another recommendation I have, especially if you're doing online newsletters, is using an email marketing software platform. Most of them now have stock images that you are allowed to use as part of the service that you're getting from the email marketing software. There's a lot of different options out there these days. Some of them are cheap, some of them are low cost. You can find one that works for you. At iContact, one of the great things that they have at iContact is that they give reduced rate plans to nonprofits, and then for North Carolina nonprofits, they actually give free accounts, which is pretty cool. And then what about music? So with music, you also run into those copyright issues, right? Like you can't use a song from the Beatles without paying the Beatles a lot of money. So there are some sites where you can get free music to use for your video projects. YouTube actually has a huge library of free music that you can use for your project. And that's typically where I go first if I'm making video content, because they have a ton, and you can search by genre, mood. It's a really great platform that they have on YouTube. There are a few sites that have free music. They're not as easy to navigate as YouTube's platform, but they are available if you can't find what you're looking for on YouTube. Or there's also some sites where you can purchase a license in order to use the music, and they range in price, but it's typically going to be more expensive than what you would pay to license a copyrighted image. And that's it from my side.
All right, thank you so much, Kyle, for that very interesting presentation. Next up, we are going to have Jennifer Murawski give a case study about JETAA Northern California. Before we do that, normally we hold all questions at the end, but we had a few comments in the chat box that I want to address. So I believe Jennifer, you can share your slide anytime now, but Jennifer pointed out, I believe that the lawsuit was with Robin Thicke, not
and Farrell. Yeah. No.
Yeah, and Mark asked about the difference between copyright with a W-R-I-T-E versus copyright with a R-I-G-H-T. I believe it's copyright with a R-I-G-H-T, referring to this particular topic. And then Mark asked as well that do even Creative Commons licenses require clear attribution? Kyle, maybe you could answer that one.
So yes, with Creative Commons, each license has its own rules, but as a general rule, yes, you have to have clear attribution when you're using Creative Commons. Now that said, a lot of these websites such as Pexels and Unsplash, those are copyright free images, and you do not need to provide attribution, and it will clearly state in the license before you download that image, you do not need to provide attribution for this image, but it would be nice if you did or wanted to. And what I typically recommend to my clients when they're doing their email marketing is they can provide that attribution in the alt text for the image, which is a best practice anyway of putting that alt text into your emails. And so that's a way that you can provide the attribution without it kind of messing up with the design and flow of your email.
Thank you. That's a really clever way to do that. Okay, great. We're going to move on to Jennifer, and then we'll take any other questions at the end. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is something of a case study of a related issue that our chapter had in Northern California and Nevada that ties in very well with what Kyle had been talking about in terms of having a copyright challenge come up and how the chapter dealt with it. So some people saw this on the JET chapter leaders Facebook group. I'm just going to go into some brief details. If you have more specifics you want to ask about, I'm happy to discuss it in further detail. And a few people have given me off the record advice that I don't want to attribute to a specific person, but I can just generally speak about some of the things that came up after the fact. Okay. All right, so for those that are not familiar with JETAA, we have been around for longer than I think most of the JETAA chapters in the United States, except for maybe JETAA. And a lot of people don't necessarily know. Every JET chapter seems to have a slightly different organization. And so I usually just like to tell people that JETAA has two levels of leadership. And so some of what happened with this particular case tied into the fact that we have two levels of decision making. We have a board of directors who tend to be alumni who have been involved with the chapter for a long time, as well as community advisors from different businesses and government organizations. And then we have an executive committee, which includes our president, vice president, all of our officers who handle the day-to-day chapter business. The other thing that's helpful to know is that our website, JETAANC.org, is a WordPress site that we've hosted for at least 10 years. It may have been around a little longer than that, but so there's a lot of content on the site that has been there for longer than any of our current officers have been around. So the challenge we had was that our chapter used to have a very wonderful newsletter called Pacific Bridge, with content written by JET alumni and sometimes friends of JET. I'm fairly certain that the last issue was published sometime before 2014, probably just before then, or maybe even in 2014. And this was archived on our website. And so, of course, with a WordPress site where the content is and had been very well updated, it had been really well maintained by the chapter, it also meant that it had been really optimized for search engines to find. So while the content itself was archived as PDFs, you know, it was all on our website and there were blog posts about it, et cetera. And so this newsletter contained lots of original photographs taken by chapter officers and alumni. And there was a little bit of editorial content about chapter activities or major news in the JET alumni community. And so what happened here is that just as Kyle mentioned, that these image holding firms have new software, which is very, very good at scanning for copyright violations. A newsletter that was published in 2008 contained a photo which one of the major news agencies had released. And there was some confusion, or at the time it wasn't entirely clear if our chapter had official license records, is how I would put it. There was something of an agreement between different chapters to use an image, as I have heard. And so there was an image from a news agency that was published in a story in our newsletter. The main thing about this that is interesting is not actually the use of the image itself. In 2008, when this was done, there really was no expectation that these firms would have the ability to go through PDFs hosted on a web. Like, this was a single image on a PDF in an archived WordPress site for which the traffic is, you know, I'm not saying that there's no traffic, but I certainly won't call a JET chapter website one of the most popular websites in the country, for example. But over time, because this content was hosted on a WordPress site and the files were accessible, also archived on this WordPress site's database, copyright firms looking for certain keywords, looking for uses of images that they had and matching them up, essentially were able to identify this photo as being part of a PDF. And so earlier this summer, our chapter received, I won't call it a cease and desist letter, I'll call it a cease and you owe us money and desist letter, where they basically said, you know, we have found this image use violation on your chapter's website, that, you know, here's the proof, like we have saved it, we've downloaded it, we've hosted it on our website as a screenshot so you can see that it's clear. You can't just delete this and pretend it never happened, and that you owe us an exorbitant amount of money. And so, of course, our first reactions were, is this a real agency? Is this some kind of scam? All of our people went through this initial, like, this sounds like a scam to me because of the way it was phrased in certain ways. But we checked, and it really was from an agency that really was the copyright watchdog for one of the big news agencies. And presumably they get a cut of any funding they manage to recover from violators. The main thing was, because this involved using chapter funds to potentially pay this off, or having some kind of potential legal consultation just to check what was the best course of action for our chapter to do, our board looked into it. They had a JET alumni who was a lawyer consult as well. And then the board reported to me that their decision, since they generally handle the long-term operation of the chapter, and it's any legal or financial issues that go beyond the officer roles, their decision was that they would appeal, but they expected that since it was an actual violation, it wasn't like this was some, oh, we accidentally used it. There was some question, could this be fair use? But whatever happened with the board discussions with legal counsel, what happened was the chapter took down the images, took down the archive of the newsletter, where if any issues had content that couldn't be verified, at least as a temporary stopgap. And we ended up paying a portion of the fee, not the entire fee they had asked for, but a smaller portion. We argued that we were a nonprofit, et cetera, all the usual things you would argue in this case. the main point of this is not really the situation with the letter, so much as one of the challenges of being especially a JET chapter where, you know, there may be officer turnover on a regular basis, just as people switch roles or move on with different things, is you don't always know what your chapter is hosting on your chapter's website. I mean, in my case, I knew that we'd had this great newsletter. I had read some of the back issues, but I never did a thorough accounting of, when I took over as president of the chapter, I never did a full accounting of what all the content on our website was. You know, some of this stuff had been there for so long, it was way, way back in the website archive. It wasn't even on my radar that this stuff existed. And, you know, to some extent I could say, well, you know, obviously that's my fault for not, you know, getting a good grip on what was on the website. But at the same time, I don't really feel like I did anything unusual or wrong. I just think it was unfortunate. And so, you know, there's this idea like in the clerks, I'm not even supposed to be here today. This kind of like, you know, I didn't even do this, and apparently it's my problem kind of feeling. But, you know, I mean, really, like with this kind of thing, our board and our officers all agreed. It's just an unfortunate situation where technology got better and better and was able to identify things that I'm sure, you know, were considered, you know, as possible fair use at the time. And it's really just the fact that this has enough financial value to an agency to look for violations. And so, again, our chapter, we really don't think anybody did anything wrong. Even back in 2008, we think it was just unfortunate that the way it was used is, you know, a little bit, it falls into that questionable area and would require a lot of effort to go back and forth with this company. And so the board decided it was better to just pay this smaller fee than it was to continuously go back and forth. Is that the right decision? I don't know. What I can tell you is it ended the problem very quickly and saved us all a lot of headache. And to be frank, you know, our chapter has had some, you know, challenges in the last year or two with paperwork and other situations where we were pretty burned out from dealing with prolonged situations. So I think in the end it was the right decision. It may not be the right decision for every chapter. And some people have given some feedback to say, oh, well, you know, I work in this industry, or I'm related to this industry. I probably would have done X or Y, or, you know, you probably could have ignored the letter and they would have just let it go. There were some things about the letter I can go into with anybody who has questions if you want to know more specifics about it. But really, the end result is for our chapter, we really wanted to protect ourselves. We've been around for a long time. It was an actual violation, you know, in the most general terms. And it prompted us to really do a more thorough review of the website, to look for any images where we couldn't identify their provenance, or to replace them with either Creative Commons or copyright-free photos where we had proof. To do some Google image searches and check, like, was anything we were using, would it come up? So I definitely would tell anyone who faces this kind of situation, the first thing to do is try not to make it a problem at all, of course, and just familiarize yourself with the public-facing content your chapter has. And the second thing is, in our case, I brought this to our board immediately, and it's possible that what I could have done if I had reversed the order of operations was bring it to the national JET community just to get a better sense of if anybody had dealt with this before. So that's one case where I will say, please take advantage of the network of JET expertise and see. I mean, we did have a lawyer in our chapter who was able to assist, I think, but it's, you know, that's where it stands. The other thing I'll mention is, and this is possibly, Bahia, a topic for a future webinar because it's come up in our chapter several times in the last few months, is we are one of the chapters that is a 501c3 nonprofit. And we talked about, like, how should chapters prepare if these kind of things come up? You know, I'm not sure if our board has D&O liability policy as an example, and that made us really nervous. These are just directors and officers insurance for anyone who's not familiar with that term. Do we need to have a rainy day fund, which we set aside just for emergencies? Is that our basic accounts purpose? That kind of thing. And then just to build on what Kyle had said about some of the best practices, in consultation with our board, the officers hammered out a new set of practices that we're going to follow and put into effect immediately this summer. The first of which is just stick with as much as possible photos that our chapter members have taken. And that every photo we use has to have the credit, just as Kyle said. It must be immediately obvious. Either you put it on the photo directly in image editing software, or you put a note underneath it. or if you post it on Facebook, to put it in the comment on the photo. It's very easy to set up a team account on canva.com for free, or you can pay a monthly membership fee and then just use a single account for your chapter. This is really helpful because it really keeps track of everything you've done, especially if you're making posts for social media or Eventbrite. We found it very, very helpful. One of our policies is there are lots of stock photo sites, and some of them I've seen photos that I don't really fully confidently believe they have the rights to, just as Kyle had warned that sometimes things on Flickr are not legitimate photos for use. It's someone reposting content. And so we're strongly recommended that people use reputable stock photo sites where it's very easy to check the legitimacy, and it's not a site that's just archiving massive amounts of photos that it may have trolled from other parts of the internet. And then always include, when you use Wikimedia Commons or Creative Commons, always include the required information, which is especially the applicable license, because sometimes the licensing terms on photos change. But if you were grandfathered in under the previous license, you're not in trouble. Or that's a very broad statement, but I'll just say you should actually track the specifics of the license. And also, more critically for us, is as we have officers change, et cetera, sometimes paperwork goes missing or we can't find things in email or Google Drive. So we have a new policy that you must submit the license agreement for the photo so that we can all reference it. One of the things I learned from this policy is that you can do a reverse image search on google.com. If you're not aware, that means you can upload the image, or you can take the URL of wherever the image is hosted, put it into images.google.com, and it will look for other sites that host the issue, that host that image, so you can try to find the source, or visually similar images where there might be some confusion. Someone pointed out to me that Google is not the end-all be-all of this, and that there are some other sites like Yandex was especially recommended to me, which I believe is a Russian site, where you can find a lot more things, including, someone told me it's really good for searching for things that are hosted on like Instagram and other things that may not be quite so easy to find on Google Images. And also, frequently, we're just doing the simplest, least time consuming thing. When you're in doubt, just don't use the image. Like, just make everyone's life easier. We're an all volunteer organization. Nobody wants to spend hours and hours going down the rabbit hole of this stuff. Just change the design. It's so much easier. And the last thing is, there are other intellectual property issues, which are less common as violations, but I definitely would say fonts.google.com has a huge archive of fonts that you can use with their licensing. It's not necessarily universal, but I think it's a really good way to get everybody on branding, the same branding for your chapter, just to make it really common. Everybody downloads the same font or creates stuff on Canva, which pulls from Google Fonts. And then if anything is being used for purposes that would create income for the chapter, it must be used. Like, a random officer can't just create something and then turn it into something which is revenue generating for the chapter. We really want to be extra cautious about any issue where we might have actually made money off of something. I don't know what that would be, but we just put it out there because we wanted to have rules that covered all of the most common bases. The last thing I'll say is, yeah, you can say that, I wasn't supposed to be here today. This happened before my time, but it really doesn't mean that much to any legal entities that might try to come after you for violations. So definitely try to familiarize yourself, or just make it a thing that you have on the calendar every year, 2 years, 3 years, however long it is, to just check in and look at what you've got posted. Maybe you should delete old posts or remove images from things that are no longer, where the image itself is no longer relevant, and just leave like the blog post up, for example. And then this idea of SEO, search engine optimization, versus CYA, or cover your butt, which is someone suggested to us, sort of putting it out there, that if you have things like PDFs and such, you may want to host them on a third-party site instead of your chapter's actual website, just to add a little layer of complication for search engines to find things and look. I don't really know if that's great advice, but it's certainly something that we've used elsewhere, to just host things in a central location and you know, it may help someone to just be able to find things if they're not familiar with how some of the website software works. So yeah, we just recommend from what we've learned that full review of assets was very helpful for us. And I think that more chapters may find it a little bit easier if some of these things, if you don't let them become problems and you handle them early on in the process. So last but not least, I know this may be before the copyright. I'm not sure if it's before the copyright law switchover, but I absolutely did not want to put a copyright violating image into my presentation. And so just to say, I drew this for all of you to enjoy. Thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really interesting. I would like to let everybody know that we're going to go into a Q&A now. And if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask your question verbally via the audio, or you can use the Q&A function. So while we're waiting for people to ask questions, if they have them, I have a question actually for Jennifer. Mm-hmm. Jennifer, how did you determine that the letter was legitimate?
Yeah, the name of the agency and the agency's website were on the letter, obviously. And so, of course, the very first thing we did was go looking at their website and checking it out, and then going to the news agency website that actually is the source of the image. And of course, we did find on their website, which was the first step toward proving the legitimacy, that they had a very clear section that said all violations of our images are enforced by the firm that sent us the letter. And so it was like, yes, people kept trying to insist to me, are you really sure it's not a scam? And I said, it really could be a scam. But I mean, at some point, like, you know, we looked into it, you know, our legal advice looked into it, and it was not a scam. It was just opportunistic. I think what someone had said to me from another chapter at some point was, what did they say? It was essentially to the equivalent of, I think you since they only sent these letters to you by mail, and it was really clearly somewhat of a fishing expedition that they were looking for violations for easy money, you probably could have ignored it longer and it might have just gone away. And my answer was yes, but they sent us 4 different letters over the course of like a month and a half. And although they claimed they had emailed our chapter, we could find no proof in any existing email account. We could find nothing on the website posts or comments associated with it. So I'm fairly certain it was a stock letter, of course, that they just insert details into. But when our board took over, our board chair is one of the longest served. I think he's been on our board for 30 years at this point, practically, and is himself involved in for his so you need to sort this out. Like, it's not a good idea for the chapter to pretend like stick our fingers in our ears and la our way out of this situation. Like, that could lead us to an even bigger problem that we really don't want to deal with. So let's make this right, and then let's also ensure that it doesn't happen again insofar as we can control that.
Thank you. Kyle, do you have any comments on JETAA NC's situation? And if anybody is wondering and they didn't catch it by their logo, this is JETAA Northern California and not JETAA
North Carolina, as I used to think years ago. Yep.
So yeah, Kyle, do you have any comments on their situation?
Yeah, you know, I think it was one of those situations where you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, right?
Yep.
You know, you could have just ignored it and it probably would have gone away. But what if it didn't? Then you're facing having to go to court, you know, dealing with a lawyer, you know, all these things. And so if it were me, I would have done, I think, the same things. And I strongly encourage other JETAA chapters, if you have historical content out on the internet, that you need to go and take a look at it. And if you're not sure if something, you know, is a free copyright or whatever, just get rid of it. It's not worth keeping it up and having that liability on yourself.
Yeah, and I can comment that one thing that came up with us as an example was we found a repeated image that kept appearing in certain topical blog posts on our website. And our suggestion was not delete every single one of these blog posts. It was replace them with a very similar stock photo that we have the license for. So
yeah,
like,
most definitely.
yeah, really simple to do that kind of thing and just clean it up and make everyone's life easier. And the other thing I would mention is one of the things we found when we screened through our website was we found some information about historical film screenings. Now this is a slightly different issue than images, but one of the things, I used to run film festivals in my previous work, film festivals related to Japan, no less. What I suggested to people, based on having had conversations with Japanese film distributors, UK distributors of Japanese film, American companies that distribute films, et cetera, is that it's been off the record advised to me by a major international rights holder for Asian films that if you do film screenings, it is very unlikely for most Japanese companies to realize that you do them if you're just kind of quiet about them. That is not official advice to do that, by the way. I'm just stating for any chapters that have held public performances of films, you may want to just delete some of the evidence of that on your website if it's something that had happened historically, or just take some care in how you present these things in your chapter's history, not because I think people are really looking for past violations of that sort, but because in some cases for film screenings, the penalties are far harsher than they are for image hosting. And if you have a bad situation where your chapter has agreed to do something or did something in the recent past that maybe if you actually looked at public performance rights, law and fines and everything else, you maybe would not have chosen to do in the same way. And so if anyone is doing anything with film screenings, I don't know that I'm the resident expert among all the JETAA chapters. I will just say I've had a lot of opportunity trying to figure out the process, work with different film studies professors and different licensing agencies. And it may be that if you're looking for some information on that I could point you in the right direction, or at least introduce you to some other JETs who might be able to assist further. But yeah, I would be very cautious about putting things on your website that you did not purchase the official licensing for, even if it was in the past. And I saw there was a question from May. Could I clarify about creating our own thing that accidentally generates money for JET, so we could use our own pictures or create one, but just don't sell it for revenue as well. What I was referring to is, for example, I'm just going to come up with a hypothetical here. You create chapter tote bags that have a photo of sakura trees in bloom in Ueno Park. And you're not sure of what the licensing of that photo of sakura trees is, but you printed it or sold it as a chapter fundraiser or did it as a giveaway. I mean, these are really hypothetical, but I'm just saying anybody in our policy going forward, and I guess in reverse as well, but now it's just formalized, is to say, if we were going to create t-shirts or tote bags or hats or something to that effect, that contain, like, I'll give you an example, like, something like a Hello Kitty image or something, like, we really need to be very cautious about these things. It's pretty rare that our chapter would do something like that, but it's certainly, we've made t-shirts and tote bags and things in the past with our chapter's logo. But it's just to say we wanted all of our officers to be aware that there's a more stringent screening by officers and possibly the board if you are doing something that we would generate income from, as opposed to just putting an image on an email, for example. And we had this discussion too about emails. What if the image was hosted on old MailChimp campaigns? We can't delete them. They're hosted on MailChimp. It's very hard to go in and edit your old email messages. That's another question that we're currently looking into, what our best options are. But it's just to say, sometimes the sins of the past exist in places you wouldn't even look for them. And they're not hosted on our website, so the most likely target would be for someone to go to MailChimp, for example. But I just wouldn't want us to be put in a position where officers have to burn valuable time spent on the chapter on issues that are not really supporting alumni or working with grassroots organizations, but are more, tidying up annoying legal situations. It just feels like a kind of waste of time if it could be avoided.
And additionally to that point, in terms of licensing for images that would be used for things for sale, generally it's a different type of license that is more expensive if you're going to use something for commercial use. And so, you know, if you are going to do that, make sure you have purchased that license and that you have, you know, your chapter has copies of that purchase that you have made, so that if anything, if it's ever called into question, you can show without a doubt that you had that you are allowed to use it in that way.
Yeah, and I should mention too that the copyright letters we got very clearly said right at the top, if you have proof of licensing, you just need to show us the proof, and this has all gone away. You know, so they were very clear, like this won't be a problem if this is accidental, you know, then we wash our hands of the situation. Thank you for providing the proof that we couldn't find in our own database. I definitely think, yeah, the copyright issue gets tricky, and frequently, sometimes the wall that you run into, actually, Kyle, which is why I think this is great that you gave the presentation you did, is you might try to ask different organizations for advice, and almost always the very first thing out of anyone's mouth, from reference librarians to, you know, just people that would seem knowledgeable, is, I'm not giving you legal advice about copyright. I can point you to some general resources, but I am absolutely not going to answer your specific questions. I am not going to give you advice that may turn out to be untrue in the aftermath of the situation, for which you could blame me. So it is pretty tricky to find solid advice if you have unusual situations or you're not sure where you fall in certain guidelines. So I will say that this is something where take advantage of the expertise of the community, because most of us are willing to talk off the record, at least, about, you know, specifics.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. Are there any further questions from anybody? Okay, Kyle, do you have any final comments for this webinar?
Yeah, I think the main thing is just, if you're not sure, don't use it. I mean, that's the best way to protect yourself. Just don't use things that you're not sure what the licensing is. There's plenty of options on the internet these days for free copyright material. And I would say like 99.9% of the time, whatever you're putting out there for public consumption is not going to need the use of copyrighted material. So just don't use it.
Thank you. Jennifer, do you have any final comments?
No, I think this pretty much covered any advice I would give or have, but it's mostly just to say, join us on the JETAA chapter leaders group on Facebook, or contact us, and we're happy to provide more information or detail on some of these situations, even if we don't have specific advice for, you know, something that's really out of our rate of expertise or our authority. But yeah, I think this is really helpful. And to be honest with you, I kind of wish I'd had a crash course in it of like what to watch out for as a chapter leader when I agreed to be president, just because I feel like some of this stuff, I'm like, wow, you know, this seems like common sense in retrospect, but I had a lot on my plate at the time, and it just didn't occur to me that I should take some time and you know, clean up some of the past before I moved forward with our chapter. So yeah, you know, accidents happen. Like sometimes, you know, it's easier to just admit fault or pay it off. Like there's a reason so many lawsuits settle, right? Because it's easier for everyone involved. And so I hope no one else has to go through this situation, but at the very least, learn from our experience. And thank you for setting this up, Bahia and Casey.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. And Jennifer and Kyle, your insight and personal experiences have been, I hope, will be very helpful to the chapters. And as you said, Jen, let's people learn from other people's mistakes so that they, you know, they don't end up in the same kind of situation. So I just want to thank again Jennifer and Kyle so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. Our next webinar will be in the alumni webinar series, and it's going to be on JETs who pursue service careers through organizations such as AmeriCorps and Peace Corps. That webinar will be on December 11th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and I hope that you will join us. Stay tuned for the recording of this webinar to be posted by next week. It will be available on the USJETAA website. Facebook page and the Facebook event page for this particular webinar. Thank you so much for joining. If you have suggestions for future webinars, I encourage you to let me know. You can reach me by email at director@usjetaa.org. And if there is a topic you would like us to cover, please shoot me an email and let me know. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night. Good night.